Well, ladies and gentlemen, it would seem as if Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is trying to destroy our country again. You see, yesterday afternoon, the Supreme Court convened to weigh in on the constitutional legitimacy of universal injunctions being used to halt President Trump's America First policies. Really, these rogue orders are a progressive plot in order to undermine the America First mandate that we all voted for in 2024. In truth, nationwide universal injunctions weaponized by a radically progressive federal judiciary are shredding our democracy. Unelected judges are stealing President Trump's executive authority to enact the policies tens of millions of Americans overwhelmingly voted for just a couple months ago. As many of you know, the U.S. Constitution grants the president, not the federal district judges, the power to execute the will of the American people. Yet, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson defended these injunctions in what is perhaps the most incompetent way possible. And so, folks, I want you to take a look at that. Then we are going to have a lot to talk about.
I would think we'd want the system to move as quickly as possible to reach the merits of the issue and maybe have this court decide whether or not the government is entitled to do this under the law. Wouldn't having universal injunctions actually facilitate that? It seems to me that when the government is completely enjoined from doing the thing it wants to do, it moves quickly to appeal that, to get it to the Supreme Court, and that's actually what we would want. What I worry about is similar to what Justice Kagan points out, is that if the government is saying no lower court can completely enjoin it, it actually means that the government just keeps on doing the purportedly unlawful thing, and it delays the ability for this court to reach the underlying issue.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot to unpackage here, but before we do, I want to say real quick that if you guys enjoy the daily news updates, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a ton. But okay, check this out. Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson just argued that universal injunctions are a good thing because by allowing the federal judiciary to limit the authority of the president, more cases will make their way to the Supreme Court, giving the Supreme Court more input on the day-to-day operations of the country. Now, beyond this being a blatant and obvious judicial power grab, as things currently stand, the Supreme Court receives around 8,000 petitions per year in which people are requesting that the Supreme Court review their case. But each year, the Supreme Court only grants around 80 of those cases a review because they just don't have the time needed to review any more than that. So even if we all agreed that the federal judiciary should be able to universally impede the president's executive authority, and that the Supreme Court should be the ones making every single decision in the entire country, logistically, it just wouldn't work. This just further proves Justice Jackson's complete and total incompetence and blind thirst for power. Now, luckily, not all of our Supreme Court justices are as incompetent as Justice Jackson. In fact, I want you all to take a look at what Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas had to say about all of this.
General, when were the first universal injunctions used?
We believe that the best reading of that is what you said in Trump against Hawaii, which is that Wirtz in 1963 was really the first universal injunction. There's a dispute about Perkins against Lukens Oil going back to 1940. And of course, we point to the court's opinion that reversed that universal injunction issued by the D.C. Circuit and said it's profoundly wrong. Now, if you look at the cases that the either party cite, you see a common theme. The cases that we cite, like National Treasury's Employment Union, Perkins against Lukens Oil, Frothingham and Massachusetts against Mellon, going back to Scott against Donald, and all of those are cases where the court considered and addressed the sort of universal, in that case, statewide issue of provision of injunctive relief. So when the court has considered and addressed this, it has consistently said you have to limit the remedy to the plaintiffs who appearing in court and complaining of that remedy.
So we survived until the 1960s without universal injunctions.
That's exactly correct. And in fact, those are very limited, very rare, even in the 1960s. It really exploded in 2007 in our cert petition in Summers against Earth Island Institute. We pointed out that the Ninth Circuit had started doing this in a whole bunch of cases involving environmental claims.
So, folks, finally, we hear from a Supreme Court justice who actually has some common sense. As Justice Thomas said, universal injunctions weren't even used until the 1960s, meaning that our country operated for almost 200 years without them. So clearly, they can't be that important to the well being of the country. In truth, all these universal injunctions do is unconstitutionally limit the president's executive authorities. Very clearly, the ultimate goal of the radical progressives like Supreme Court Justice Jackson is to empower the federal judiciary to such a degree that we don't even have a form of democracy anymore. No, instead, we would have a judicial tyranny. Their dream is for radically progressive, unelected federal judges to subvert the democratically elected president's executive authorities whenever they see fit. Then, if they get any pushback on it, to just fall back on the Supreme Court, appealing to far left Supreme Court justices like Justice Jackson. And so, very clearly, this is not how our founding fathers intended for our country to operate, proven by the fact that universal injunctions weren't ever even used until the 1960s, which means we've just caught Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson once again betraying the oath that she swore to uphold our nation's Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, frankly, if we don't shut down these universal, nationally sweeping federal injunctions, this problem is only going to get worse. President Trump's constitutionally granted executive authority will be effectively castrated, at which point we might as well not even have elections anymore. But with all of that being said, we do have some good news today. As things currently stand, it does seem as if the Supreme Court is going to rule in the favor of President Trump's constitutionally granted executive power. And so, folks, here's the truth. Radical progressives like Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson are panicking because they know that their days of operating a judicial tyranny are coming to an end. They know that the America First movement is unstoppable, and they know that their entire radically progressive house of cards is about to come crashing down. They know that they can't maintain control of the country by means of actually winning free and fair elections. Americans won't vote for them anymore. So these nationally sweeping universal injunctions were really their last-ditch effort to maintain what little power they had left. So once again, I don't want to speak too soon here, but it does seem as if these universal injunctions are about to be shut down in the Supreme Court, and you know what? Thank God, because now it is time to put America first. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap up, I do want to say real quick that we officially have a Morse News Twitter page as well as a Morse News Facebook page. So if you use either of those platforms, please go down below and drop a follow in order to get breaking news updates that relate to everything we talk about here in the YouTube videos. But everyone, that is going to be a wrap for today's video, so please go down below and drop a comment. Let me know what you think about all of this. Please like the video while you're down there, and like I said earlier, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a ton. Thank you all very much for tuning in today, and of course, as always, stay safe.